everyone, and welcome to Toronto Steelworkers Hall. My name is Chris Webb, and I'm a member of the Canadian Dimension Editorial Collective. And it's my pleasure to welcome Chris Hedges back to Toronto. This is the second event he's done here for Canadian Dimension, and we hope it's the second of many more to come. So please give a round of applause for Chris Hedges. As I mentioned, the event this evening is sponsored by Canadian Dimension magazine with support from the Centre for Social Justice. Let me be brief and say that for those of you who are interested in progressive opinions, news, and debate, which I assume is most of you in this room, Canadian Dimension is an absolute must. So if you have not subscribed already, this is my PR advertising bit, please go to canadiandimension.com, take out a subscription. Chris Hedges writes for the magazine. We have other fantastic writers from the independent left in Canada writing for the magazine too, so please check us out online. In so many ways, it's appropriate that we're hosting Chris Hedges in the Toronto Steelworkers Hall, a space that's been central to labour and social justice organising in Toronto over the last, 50 years. 5 years ago, I remember sitting in this exact room, holding meetings that we planned to oppose the G8 and the G20 when they were in Toronto. And I'm sure many of us were at those meetings and remember the incredible crackdown on freedom of expression, dissent, and movement in our city. And that's an incident that we are still waiting for answers on. Today we find ourselves nearing a federal election with so many of the issues that we'd like to see debated and discussed are simply not on the table. We have a Prime Minister who is working to dismantle our social welfare system, who has militarized Canadian foreign policy, who has criminalized refugees, who seems unfazed by the urgency of climate change, and who's committed to a form of economic austerity that is hurting workers and the poor. I could go on, but I think you know what a bastard is. In the face of all this, we have of course seen resistance and revolts in many forms. From struggles against austerity in Europe, to movements against police brutality in the US, to a growing anti-pipelines movement here in Canada. Thousands of people have chosen to stand up and fight back, and Chris Hedges is with us tonight to talk about those rebels and those revolutionaries who have fought against injustice both in the past and in the present, which is the focus of his new book, Wages of Rebellion, The Moral Imperative of Revolt. If you'd like to purchase a copy of this book, it's for sale at a table at the back of the room over there, and you can do so after the Q&A. And now I'm going to turn it over to Mersiha to introduce Chris and go over the structure for tonight's event.
Good evening, my name is Mersiha, and thank you all for coming. This is definitely a special evening, since it's not that often that we get to hear from a journalist who has stayed true to his profession. Unfortunately, many journalists today have forgotten what it means to be a real journalist. Far too often you'll see journalists serving as government mouthpieces where they fail to question the official narrative that is fed to them, and in the end, the public is greatly misinformed. You'll see a lot of journalists today conducting softball interviews with certain presidents and prime ministers and other people who hold positions of power, flattering them instead of challenging them, asking them the right questions, and holding those in power to account. So they do the exact opposite of what a real journalist should do. Journalism in its truest form is to defend the less powerful from the more powerful. It's to speak the truth in the face of an unjust ruler. It's to give the oppressed a voice and a chance to be heard. So Hedges has devoted his life to this, as I'm sure you all know. And through his work, we've seen that he's been relentless in the pursuit of truth. So we're very thankful to have him here with us tonight. Wherever injustice has been committed, you can be sure that Hedges will be there to write about it. He's covered it all, from mass incarceration to the disparity between the poor and the rich, to the illegal wars that the U.S. wages abroad, to corporations that are destroying our planet. He's written about Gaza, Palestinians, and he's really helped to open our eyes to the illusion that we live in today as a society. So through his work, he has shown that he deeply cares about humanity and has spent a great amount of time and effort in exposing the truth about what is being done today by the rich and the powerful, which is what a true journalist should do. And I'm sure you're all aware of how amazing he is, so we'll get to it. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our special guest, Chris Hedges.
Thank you very much. I have growing Canadian connections. My daughter is a senior at UBC. My son has just moved in with his girlfriend, who is from Montreal and was one of the leaders of the student Quebec movements. As my wife said, not only is she great, but she's Canadian and she's not white. And my wife, who left here when she was 17 to go to Juilliard and has remained in New York, we're up here visiting our parents from Scarborough, which I guess is what the earth looks like when you assassinate all your urban planners. And we have been all of the high cultural events of the city, Science Museum, the aquarium, Kinky Boots. We have missed this time around the pickle barrel because we're vegans now, so I'm going to spare the pickle barrel. But the probably the low point of the week was being in a crowd and having someone who recognized me come up and pull out their cell phone and go, "Oh my God, it's Chris Hedges at Canada Wonderland. I can't believe it. I gotta." Well, thank you very much for coming. I'd like to thank Canadian Dimension, which is a magazine I respect very much. The left is still alive in Canada, barely. Not anymore in my country, which I'm going to speak a lot about because what's happening is becoming very, very frightening and will have ramifications across the border and consequences across the border that are very deleterious for Canadians themselves. The ideological and physical hold of American imperial power, buttressed by the utopian ideology of neoliberalism and global capitalism, is unraveling. Most, including many of those at the heart of the American empire, recognize that every promise made by the proponents of neoliberalism is a lie. Global wealth, rather than being spread equitably, as neoliberal proponents promised, has been funneled upward into the hands of a rapacious, oligarchic elite, creating vast economic inequality. The working poor, whose unions and rights have been taken from them, and whose wages have stagnated or declined over the past 40 years, have been thrust into chronic poverty and underemployment, making their lives one long, stress-ridden emergency. The middle class is evaporating. Cities that once manufactured products and offered factory jobs are boarded up wastelands. Prisons are overflowing, and corporations have orchestrated the destruction of trade barriers, allowing them to stash $2.1 trillion in profits in overseas banks to avoid paying taxes. And the neoliberal order, despite its promise to build and spread democracy, has hollowed out democratic systems to turn them into corporate leviathans. Democracy, especially in the United States, is a farce, vomiting up right-wing demagogues such as Donald Trump, who has a serious chance to become the Republican presidential nominee and perhaps even president. Or slick, dishonest corporate stooges such as Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and if he follows through in his promise to support the Democratic nominee, even Bernie Sanders. The labels liberal and conservative are meaningless in the neoliberal order. Political elites, Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, serve the demands of corporations and empire. They are facilitators, along with most of the media and most of academia, of what the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls our system of inverted totalitarianism. And that book, Democracy Incorporated by Sheldon Wolin, is one of the pivotal studies of modern power, along with the books by John Ralston Saul, which, if you haven't read, you should. The Collapse of Globalism, Unconscious Civilization, and his masterpiece, Voltaire's Bastards. The attraction of a Trump, like the attraction of Radovan Karadzic or Slobodan Milosevic during the breakdown of Yugoslavia, is that his buffoonery, which is ultimately dangerous, mocks the bankruptcy of the political charade. It lays bare the dissembling, the hypocrisy, the legalized bribery. There is a perverted and to many refreshing honesty in this. And the Nazis used this tactic to take power during the Weimar Republic. The Nazis, even in the eyes of their opponents, had the courage of their convictions, however unsavory those convictions were. Those who believe something, even something repugnant, are often given grudging respect. These neoliberal forces are also rapidly destroying the ecosystem. The Earth has not had this level of climate disruption since 250 million years ago, when it underwent the Permian-Triassic extinction, which wiped out perhaps 90% of all species. And this is a percentage we seem determined to replicate. Global warming is unstoppable, with polar ice caps and glaciers rapidly melting and sea levels certain to rise 10 or more feet within the next few decades, flooding major coastal cities. Mega droughts are leaving huge patches of the earth, including parts of Africa and Australia, the west coast of Canada and the United States, the southwestern United States, parched and plagued by uncontrollable wildfires. In the United States, we have lost 7.2 million acres to wildfires this summer. And the Forest Service has so far spent $800 million struggling to control conflagrations in California, Washington, Alaska, and other states. The very word drought is part of the deception, implying this is somehow reversible. It isn't. Migrants fleeing violence and hunger in countries such as Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and Eritrea are pouring into Europe. 200,000 of the roughly 300,000 migrants to Europe this year have landed on the shores of Greece. 2,500 have died so far this year in the sea, on overcrowded and dilapidated boats, or in the backs of trucks, such as the one discovered in Austria that held 71 corpses, including the bodies of children. This is the largest influx of refugees into Europe since World War II, a 40% jump since last year, and the flood will grow ever greater. By 2050, many climate scientists predict between 50 million and 200 million climate refugees will have fled northward to escape areas of the globe made uninhabitable by soaring temperatures, droughts, famines, plagues, coastal flooding, and the chaos of failed states. Karl Marx exposed the peculiar dynamics of capitalism, or what he called the bourgeois mode of production. He foresaw that capitalism had built within it the seeds of its own destruction. He knew that reigning ideologies, think neoliberalism, were created to serve the interests of the elites, and in particular the economic elites, since, quote, the class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production. And the ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships, the relationships which make one class the ruling one. Marx saw that there would come a day when capitalism would exhaust its potential and collapse. He did not know when that day would come. Marx, as Meghnad Deshi wrote, was an astronomer of history, not an astrologer. Marx was keenly aware of capitalism's ability to innovate and adapt, but he also knew that capitalist expansion was not eternally sustainable. And as we witness the denouement of capitalism and the disintegration of globalism, Karl Marx is vindicated as capitalism's most prescient and important critic. In a preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx wrote, "No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed. And new higher relationships of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Therefore, mankind, or humankind, always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve. Since looking at the matter more closely, we always find that the task itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for its solution already exist, or are at least in the process of formation." In other words, socialism would not be possible, Marx wrote, until capitalism had exhausted its potential for further development. That the end is coming is hard now to dispute, although one would be foolish to predict when. The final stages of capitalism, Marx wrote, would be marked by developments that are intimately familiar to most of us. Unable to expand and generate profits at past levels, the capitalist system would begin to consume the structures that sustained it. It would prey upon, in the name of austerity, the working class and the poor, driving them ever deeper into debt and poverty, and diminishing the capacity of the state to serve the needs of ordinary citizens. It would, as it has, increasingly relocate jobs, including both manufacturing and professional positions, to countries with cheap pools of labor. Industries would mechanize their workplaces. This would trigger an economic assault not only on the working, but the middle class, the bulwark of a capitalist system that would be disguised by the imposition of massive personal debt as incomes declined or remained stagnant. Politics would, in the late stages of capitalism, become subordinate to economics, leading to political parties hollowed out of any real political content and abjectly subservient to the dictates of money and global capitalism. But as Marx warned, there is a limit to an economy built on the scaffolding of debt expansion. There comes a moment, Marx knew, when there would be no new markets available and no new pools of people who could take on more debt. This is what happened with the subprime mortgage crisis. Once the banks cannot conjure up new subprime borrowers, the scheme falls apart and the system crashes. Capitalist oligarchs, meanwhile, hoard huge sums of wealth in overseas tax havens, exacted as tribute from those they dominate in debt and impoverish. Capitalism would, in the end, Marx said, turn on the so-called free market, along with the values and traditions it claims to defend. It would, in the final stages, pillage the systems and structures that make capitalism possible. It would resort, as it caused widespread suffering, to harsher forms of repression. It would attempt, in a frantic last stand, to maintain its profits by looting and pillaging state institutions, contradicting its stated nature. Marx warned that in the later stages of capitalism, huge corporations would exercise a monopoly on global markets. The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe, he wrote. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. These corporations, whether in the banking sector, the agricultural and food industries, the arms industries, or the communications industries, would use their power, usually by seizing the mechanisms of state, to prevent anyone from challenging their monopolies. They would fix prices to maximize profit. They would, as they have been doing, push through trade deals such as the TPP and CAFTA to further weaken the nation-state's ability to impede exploitation by imposing environmental regulations or monitoring working conditions. And in the end, these corporate monopolies would obliterate free market competition. In a May editorial in the New York Times, we see a window into what Marx said would characterize the late stages of capitalism. The Times wrote, as of this week, Citicorp, JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, and the Royal Bank of Scotland are felons, having pleaded guilty on Wednesday to criminal charges of conspiring to rig the value of the world's currencies. According to the Justice Department, the lengthy and lucrative conspiracy enabled the banks to pad their profits without regard to fairness, the law, or the public good. The Times goes on. The banks will pay fines totaling $9 billion, assessed by the Justice Department as well as state, federal, and foreign regulators. That seems like a sweet deal for a scam that lasted for at least 5 years, from the end of 2007 to the beginning of 2013, during which the bank's revenue from foreign exchange was some $85 billion. The final stages of what we call capitalism, as Marx grasped, is not capitalism at all. Corporations gobble down government expenditures, in essence taxpayer money, like pigs at a trough. The U.S. arms industry, with its official $598.49 billion defense authorization bill, 53% of all federal spending in the United States, and that ignores other military expenditures tucked away in other budgets, which raises our real expenditure on national security to over $1 trillion a year, has gotten the U.S. government this year to commit to spending $348 billion over the next decade to modernize our nuclear weapons and build 12 Ohio-class nuclear submarines estimated at $8 billion apiece. Exactly how these two massive arms programs are supposed to address what we are told is the greatest threat of our time, the war on terror, is a mystery. After all, as far as I know, ISIS does not own a rowboat. We spend in the United States $100 billion a year on intelligence, read surveillance, and 70% of that money goes to private contractors, such as Bose Allen Hamilton, which gets 99% of its revenues from the U.S. government. And on top of this, we are the largest exporters of arms in the world. The fossil fuel industry swallows up $5.3 trillion a year worldwide in hidden costs to keep burning fossil fuels, according to the International Monetary Fund. This money, the IMF noted, is in addition to the $492 billion in direct subsidies offered by governments around the world through write-offs and write-downs and land use loopholes. In a sane world, these subsidies would be invested to free us from the deadly effects of carbon emissions caused by fossil fuels. But we do not live in a sane world. Bloomberg News, in an article titled "Why Should Taxpayers Give Big Banks $883 billion a year?" reported that economists had determined that government subsidies lower the big banks' borrowing costs by about 0.8%. Bloomberg News wrote, multiplied by the total liabilities of the 10 largest U.S. banks by assets, it amounts to a taxpayer subsidy of $83 billion a year. The top 5 banks, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, account, the report went on, for $64 billion of the total subsidy, an amount roughly equal to their typical annual profits. In other words, and this is Bloomberg News, the banks occupy the commanding heights of the financial industry with almost $9 trillion in assets, more than half the size of the U.S. economy, would just about break even in the absence of corporate welfare. In large part, the profits they report are essentially transfers from taxpayers to their shareholders, end quote. Marx illuminated these contradictions within capitalism. He understood that the idea of capitalism, free trade, free markets, individualism, innovation, self-development, works only in the utopian mind of a true believer such as Alan Greenspan or Stephen Harper, never in reality. The hoarding of wealth by a tiny capitalist elite, Marx foresaw, along with the exploitation of workers, meant that the masses could no longer buy the products that propelled capitalism forward. Wealth becomes concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. The world's richest 1% will own more than half of the world's wealth by next year. The assault on the working class has been going on now for several decades. Salaries have remained stagnant or declined since the 1970s. Manufacturing has been shipped overseas, where workers in countries such as China or Bangladesh are paid as little as 22 cents an hour. The working poor, forced to compete with the labor of those who are little better than serfs in the global marketplace, proliferate across the landscape, struggling to live at a subsistence level. Industries such as construction, which once provided well-paying, unionized jobs, are the domain of non-unionized, often in the United States, undocumented workers. Corporations import foreign engineers and software specialists to do their professional work at 1/3 of the normal salary on work visas, or ship that work overseas. And all these workers are bereft of the rights of citizens. The capitalist response to the collapse of their domestic economies, which they engineered, is to see them become global loan sharks and speculators. They lend money at exorbitant interest rates to the working class and the poor, even if they know the money can never be repaid, and then sell these bundled debts, credit default swaps, bonds, and stocks to pension funds, cities, investment firms, and institutions. The late form of capitalism is built on what Marx called fictitious capital, and it leads, as Marx knew, to the vaporization of money. Once subprime borrowers begin to default, as these big banks and investment firms knew was inevitable, the global crash of 2008 took place. And the governments bailed out the banks, largely by printing money, and left the poor and the working class, not to mention students recently out of college, with crippling personal debt. Austerity became policy. The victims of financial fraud would be made to pay for the fraud. And what saved us from a full-blown depression was, in a tactic Marx would have found ironic, massive state intervention in the economy, including the nationalization of huge corporations such as AIG and General Motors. What we saw in 2008 was the enactment of a welfare state for the rich, a kind of state socialism for the financial elites that Marx predicted. But with this comes an increasing and volatile cycle of boom and bust, bringing the system closer to disintegration and collapse. We have undergone 2 major stock market crashes and the implosion of real estate prices in just the first decade of the 21st century, and stability is not a word anyone is using today to describe global stock markets. The corporations that own the media have worked overtime to sell a bewildered public the fiction that we are enjoying a recovery. Employment figures through a variety of gimmicks including erasing in the United States those who are employed for over a year from employment rolls, are a lie, as is nearly every other financial indicator pumped out for public consumption. We live rather in the twilight stages of global capitalism, which may be surprisingly more resilient than we expect, but which is ultimately terminal. Marx knew that once the market mechanism became the sole determining factor for the fate of the nation state, as well as the natural world, both would be demolished. No one knows when this will happen, but that it will happen, perhaps within our lifetime, is certain. The physical, environmental, social, and political disintegration is reflected in an upsurge of nihilistic violence across the globe, driven by frustration and rage. Crazed gunmen carry out massacres in shopping malls, movie theaters, churches, and schools almost weekly in the United States. Boko Haram and Islamic State, or ISIS, are on killing rampages. Suicide attackers methodically commit deadly mayhem in Iraq, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Yemen, Algeria, Israel and the Palestine territories, Iran, Tunisia, Lebanon, Morocco, Turkey, Mauritania, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, China, Nigeria, Russia, India, and Pakistan. They struck the United States on September 11th, and in 2010, when Andrew Joseph Stack III flew a light plane into a building in Austin, Texas, that housed the offices of the Internal Revenue Service. Fanaticism is bred by hopelessness and despair. It is not the product of religion, although religion often becomes the sacral veneer for violence. The more desperate people become, the more this nihilistic violence will spread. The old is dying, the new struggles to be born, and in the interregnum there are many morbid symptoms, Antonio Gramsci wrote. These morbid symptoms will expand until we radically reconfigure how we relate to each other and the ecosystem that sustains us. But there is no guarantee such a reconfiguration is possible, especially if the elites manage to cling to power through their pervasive global security and surveillance apparatus and heavily militarized police forces. If we do not overthrow this neoliberal system, and overthrow it soon, we will unleash a Hobbesian nightmare of escalating state violence and counter-violence. Masses of the poor will be condemned to misery and death. Some will try to violently resist. A tiny elite living in a modern version of Versailles or the Forbidden City will have access to amenities denied to everyone else. Hatred will become the primary ideology. The attraction of the Islamic State, which has up to 30,000 foreign fighters, is that it articulates the rage felt by the wretched of the earth and has thrown off the shackles of Western domination. It defies the neoliberal attempt to turn the oppressed into human refuse. You can condemn the group's medieval vision of Islam and its campaigns of terror against Shiites, Yazidis, Christians, women, and homosexuals, which I do. But the anguish that inspires this savagery is genuine. You can condemn the racism of white supremacists who are flocking to Donald Trump, as I do. But what they are responding to is a similar frustration and despair. The neoliberal order, by turning people into superfluous labor, and by extension, superfluous human beings, orchestrated this anger. And the only hope left is to reintegrate the dispossessed into the global economy, to give them a sense of possibility and hope, to give them a future. Short of that, nothing will stem rising fanaticism. Islamic State, much like the Christian right, seeks a return to an unachievable purity and utopianism, a heaven on earth. It promises to establish a version of the 7th century caliphate. And 20th century Zionists seeking to form Israel used the same playbook when they called for the recreation of the mythical Jewish nation of the Bible. ISIS, as the Jewish fighters who founded Israel did, is attempting to build its state, now the size of Texas, through ethnic cleansing, terrorism, and the use of foreign fighters. Its utopian cause, as was the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War, is attractive to tens of millions of youths, most of them Muslims, cast aside by the neoliberal order. Islamic State offers a vision of a broken society made whole. It offers a place, a sense of identity, denied by neoliberalism, to those who embrace its vision. It calls for a turning away from the deadening cult of the self that lies at the core of neoliberal ideology. It holds up the sanctity of self-sacrifice, and it offers an avenue for vengeance. Until we dismantle the neoliberal order and recover the humanistic tradition that rejects the view that human beings and the earth are commodities to exploit, our form of industrialized and economic barbarity will collide with the barbarity of those who oppose us. For we are not morally superior to the Islamic State. We are responsible for over 1 million dead in Iraq and 4 million Iraqis who have been displaced or forced to become refugees. We kill in greater numbers. We kill more indiscriminately. Our drones, warplanes, heavy artillery, naval bombardments, machine guns, missiles, and so-called special forces, state-run death squads, have decapitated far more people, including children, than the Islamic State. When Islamic State burned a Jordanian pilot alive in a cage, it replicated what the United States and its allies does daily to families by incinerating them in their homes in bombing strikes. It replicated what Israel warplanes do in Gaza. Yes, what the Islamic State did was cruder, but morally it was the same. I once asked the co-founder of the militant group Hamas, Dr. Abdul Aziz al-Rantisi, why Hamas sanctioned suicide bombings, which left Israeli civilians and children dead, when the Palestinians had the moral high ground as an occupied people. We will stop killing their children and civilians as soon as they stop killing our children and civilians, he told me. He noted that the number of Israeli children who had been killed at that time was a couple dozen, as opposed to hundreds of Palestinian children. And since 2000, 133 Israeli and 2,061 Palestinian children have lost their lives. Suicide bombing is an act of desperation. It is, like Israel's saturation bombing of Gaza, a war crime. But when seen as a response to unchecked state terror, it is understandable. And to understand is not to condone. But understand we must. Dr. Rantisi was assassinated in April 2004 by Israel when it fired a Hellfire missile at his car in Gaza from an Apache attack helicopter. His son, Mohammed, in the vehicle with it, also died in the attack. The downward spiral, more than a decade after these murders, continues. Those who oppose us offer a vision of a new world, and we offer nothing in return. They offer a counterweight to the neoliberal lie. They speak for its victims, trapped in squalid slums in the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and North America. They condemn the grotesque hedonism. Personal wealth is the primary basis for respect and authority. Blind, celebration of the technocrat, sexual commodification, including a culture dominated by pornography, and the drug-induced lethargy that are used by old dying regimes to keep the masses distracted and disempowered. Many jihadists, before they became violent fundamentalists, fell victim to these forces. There are hundreds of millions of people like them who have been betrayed by the neoliberal order. They are our powder keg, and we offer them nothing. The wretched of the earth, increasingly, do not believe in the efficacy of nonviolence. They saw how nonviolence failed in Tunisia, which contributes the largest number of jihadists to the fighting in Iraq and Syria. How it failed in Libya, Egypt, and Iraq, a country where the US puppet regime routinely gunned down non-violent protesters in the streets. The wretched of the earth, including in the United States, where we are seeing a mounting number of assassinations of police, 24 so far this year, intend to counter state violence with insurrectional violence. They have learned to speak the language we taught them. Keep shooting unarmed black men and women in the streets of American cities, while ignoring the nonviolent protests calling for an end to state lynching and state terror. And guess what will happen? Once their rage explodes, they recover their lost coherence. They experience self-knowledge through reconstruction of themselves. From afar, we see their war as the triumph of barbarity, Frantz Fanon wrote. But it proceeds on its own to gradually emancipate the fighter and progressively eliminates the colonial darkness inside and out. As soon as it begins, it is merciless. Either one must remain terrified or become terrifying, which means surrendering to the disassociations of a fabricated life or conquering the unity of one's native soil. When the peasants lay hands on a gun, the old myths fade, and one by one the taboos are overturned. A fighter's weapon is his humanity. For in the first phase of the revolt, killing is a necessity. Killing a European is killing two birds with one stone, eliminating in one go oppressor and oppressed, leaving one man dead and the other man free. Do those in power read history? Or maybe this is what they want. Once the wretched of the earth morph into Islamic State or adopt counter-violence, the neoliberal order can lift the final fetters that are imposed upon it and start to kill with impunity. Neoliberal ideologues, after all, are our utopian fanatics. And they too know only how to speak in the language of force. They are our version of the Islamic State. The binary world the neoliberals created, a world of masters and serfs, a world where the wretched of the earth are demonized and subdued by a loss of freedom, by austerity and violence, a world where only the powerful and the wealthy have privileges and rights, will condemn us to a horrifying dystopia. The emerging revolt in Kohet, seemingly disconnected, is rising up from the bowels of the earth. We see its flashes and spurts. We see its ideology of rage and anguish. We see its utopianism and its corpses. The more despair and desperation are manufactured by the neoliberal order, whether in Athens, Baghdad, or Ferguson, Missouri. The more the forces of state repression are used to quell unrest and extract the last drops of blood from collapsing economies, the more violence will become the primary language of resistance. This sets as our primary goal the destruction of the American empire and the dismantling of American militarism. This is not a side issue. It is the issue. It is why I refuse to give Bernie Sanders, who will not confront the war industry or the crimes of empire, including our support for the slow-motion genocide carried out by Israel against the Palestinians, a pass in these elections. Genuine socialists, such as Eugene V. Debs or Rosa Luxemburg, understood that militarists and war profiteers suck the marrow out of the state. Militarists use fear, stoked by racism, as a mantra to abolish civil liberties and crush dissent. They destroy the economy and ultimately extinguish democracy itself. They carry out sustained war crimes on behalf of business interests to plunder the earth and repress, imprison, or kill anyone who resists. Libertarians often seem to get this, but the left often misses it. Bourgeois society faces a dilemma, Luxemburg wrote, either a transition to socialism or a return to barbarism. We face the choice, either the victory of imperialism and the decline of all culture as in ancient Rome, annihilation, devastation, degeneration, a yawning graveyard, or the victory of socialism. The victory of the international working class, consciously assaulting imperialism and its method, war. This is the dilemma of world history. The U.S. and its array of civilian contractors operate as enforcers and hired killers across the globe for corporations, many of which do not pay taxes, leaving us to foot the bill and offer up our sons and daughters as cannon fodder. And the military has played this dirty role in the United States since the genocide of Native Americans, carried out on behalf of land speculators, mineral companies, timber merchants, and the railroads. The military replicated this indiscriminate slaughter with our imperial expansion at the end of the 19th century in Cuba, Central America, the Caribbean, and especially the Philippines. Military muscle exists to permit global corporations to plunder oil, minerals, and other natural resources while keeping subjugated populations impoverished by corrupt and brutal puppet regimes. Millions of the wretched of the earth have been enslaved or sacrificed by the U.S. military for the capitalist cause. And the original sin of America, slavery and genocide, runs through us like an electric current. But as insidiously, it was the war profiteers and the military, and as Brian Waddell has pointed out, conspired following World War II to keep the United States in a state of total war, deforming its economy, to continue in peacetime to produce massive amounts of armaments and weapons. The fear-mongering of the Cold War was used not only to justify crippling military expenditures, but to crush supposedly communist-inspired movements domestically and internationally that fought for social and political reform. The corporatists in the military, who have successfully carried out what John Ralston Saul calls a coup d'etat in slow motion, use their political and economic clout to ruthlessly dismantle programs and policies put in place under the New Deal. By the time they were done, workers were defenseless and the machinery of state was under their control. Waddell notes, the requirements of total war revived corporate political leverage, allowing corporate executives inside and outside the state extensive influence over wartime mobilization policies. Assertive corporate executives and military officials formed a very effective wartime alliance that not only blocked any augmentation of the New Dealer authority, but also organized a powerful alternative to the New Deal. International activism displaced and supplanted New Deal domestic activism. The war machine is not, and almost never has been, a force for liberty or democracy. It does not make us safe. It does not make the world safe. It does not promote liberty and democracy. And its immense economic and political power internally, including its management of the security and surveillance state, and its huge defense contracts, has turned it, at least within the United States, into the most dangerous institution in the country. The working and middle class fund, in essence, the endless wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen, and a host of other countries, while suffering austerity programs, debt peonage, collapsing infrastructures, unemployment and underemployment. It is their sons and daughters who line up at the recruiting stations because there are no jobs. The war industry, feeding off the carcass of the state, grows fat and powerful with profits. And this is not unique. It is how all empires are hollowed out from the inside. As we are impoverished and stripped of our rights, the tools used to maintain control on the outer reaches of empire, drones, militarized police, indiscriminate violence, a loss of civil liberties, and security and surveillance, are used on us. We have evolved, because of the poison of empire, into third world nations with nukes, and omnipotent corporate oligarchy and their Praetorian Guard rule. The political class, Republican and Democrat, liberal and conservative, dance to the tune these oligarchs and militarists play and mouth the words they want them to say. Our descent replicates a pattern common to all empires, from the Roman to the Mayan. The difference is that when we go down, because of climate change, we will take the rest of the global population with us. Collapse will be catastrophic. Edward Gibbon, in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, listed what he called 5 marks of the Roman decaying culture. These 5 marks were: concern with displaying affluence instead of building wealth, obsession with sex and perversions of sex, art becomes freakish and sensationalistic instead of creative and original, widening disparity between very rich and very poor, and increased demand to live off the state. Empires, as Joseph Schumpeter wrote in an essay called The Sociology of Imperialism, always employ the same rhetoric of fear and vital national interests to justify plunder and murder. Schumpeter makes this point when he also examined ancient Rome. There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. When it was utterly impossible to contrive such an interest, why then it was the national honor that had been insulted. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always fighting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their indubitably aggressive designs. Empire enriches the industrialized nations of the north at the expense of the poor nations of the south. The naked greed and violence that defines empire, understood by writers such as Joseph Conrad, Eduardo Galeano, who once wrote, "Each time a new war is disclosed in the name of the fight of the good against evil, those who are killed are all poor." It's always the same story, repeating over and again and again. And Arundhati Roy is masked within empire behind the cant of patriotism and nationalism, which sanctifies self-exaltation and racism. Imperial war is transformed through the magic of propaganda into glorious spectacle. The hyper-masculinity of the military, celebrated by Hollywood and the media, is seductive to an underclass trapped in menial, dead-end jobs. Empires feed like vultures on these pools of frustrated surplus labor. They manipulate their feelings of powerlessness. And this is why capitalists create pools of surplus labor. Those who are desperate to secure a place in society are easy fodder for the military and easy fodder for underpaid jobs without benefits or job security. Our corporate, neo-feudal society is by design. These elites do not serve in the military. The military, even at the highest service academies such as West Point, attracts those who have been cast aside by neoliberalism. They often, before joining the military, lacked a clearly defined identity or sense of purpose. They are terrified of being pushed permanently into the underclass. They are susceptible to indoctrination. For the military does not teach soldiers to think, to challenge assumptions and structures, only to obey and to be tough and strong. This hyper-masculine culture glorifies the state and state violence. It renders all human beings outside the sacred national circle as objects to control or exploit. It creates a binary world of good and evil. I once asked a woman who was an officer in the Canadian Army what was her most dangerous experience in Afghanistan. And she said, without joking, going to the toilets at night and trying not to get raped by the US Marines. And this is why violence against women and pornography is so pervasive in the neoliberal order. Tenderness, nurturing, empathy are banished. The weak and the vulnerable deserve to be cast aside. Our enemies must be killed. It is the culture of death, and we drink deep from this dark elixir. W.E.B. Du Bois warned that empire was the primary tool used to break the working class in Europe and later North America. As workers organized and fought for rights and fair wages, the masters of empire shifted production to countries more easily controlled, countries inhabited by darker peoples, Du Bois writes. This is a shift that is largely complete. Here are no labor unions or votes or questioning onlookers or inconvenient consciences, Du Bois wrote. These men may be used down to the very bone and shot and maimed in punitive expeditions when they revolt. In these dark lands, industrial development may repeat in exaggerated form every horror of the industrial horror of Europe, from slavery and rape to disease and maiming, with one test of success: dividends. And Du Bois also knew that the cost of maintaining empire were offset by the profits. What do nations care about the cost of war, if by spending a few hundred millions in steel and gunpowder, they can gain 1,000 millions in diamonds and cocoa? The reality of empire is nearly impossible to see from the heart of empire, and those who speak its truth are banished from the airwaves. They are condemned as traitors. The cries of empire's victims are muted. The crimes empire commits are rendered invisible. The greed of war makers, along with the corruption of the political, judicial, academic, and media courtiers that serve empire, is blocked from public view. The image of empire is scripted like a Walt Disney movie. The mythical narrative is disseminated on television by the press, in churches, in universities, and by the state. It is a massive lie, but it is a lie that works. And it works because it is what so many of us want. It appeals to our fantasies about ourselves, that we are a virtuous people, that God has blessed us above others, that we have the highest form of civilization, that we have been anointed to police the world and make it safe, that we are the most powerful and righteous nations on earth, that we are always assured of victory, that we have a right to kill in the name of nationalist values, values determined by our naked self-interest, but ones we conveniently define as universal. There can be no rational debate about empire, with many who are desperate, who have ingested this as their creed. The distortion of neoliberalism has left them with little else. Here lies the virus of fascism, wrapped in the American flag, held aloft by the Christian cross, and buttressed by white supremacy. It is a very potent and dangerous force within the United States, and it is growing. Noam Chomsky, more than any other American intellectual, blacklisted by most of the media in my country, has laid bare the latent forces of totalitarianism in our midst and warned us against the contagion of empire. Those with deep totalitarian commitments identify the state with the society, its people, and its culture, Chomsky said. Therefore, those who criticize the policies of the Kremlin under Stalin were condemned as anti-Soviet or hating Russia. For their counterparts in the West, those who criticize the policies of the US government are anti-American and hate America. Those are the standard terms used by intellectual opinion, including left liberal segments, so deeply committed to their totalitarian instincts that they cannot even recognize them, let alone understand their disgraceful history, tracing to the origins of recorded history in interesting ways. For the totalitarian, patriotism means support for the state and its policies, perhaps with twitters of protest on grounds that they might fail or cost too much. For those whose instincts are democratic rather than totalitarian, patriotism means commitment to the welfare and improvement of the society, its people, and its culture. That's a natural sentiment, and one that can be quite positive. It's one all serious activists share, I presume. Otherwise, why take the trouble to do what we do? But the kind of patriotism fostered by totalitarian societies and military dictatorships, and internalized as second nature by much of intellectual opinion in most free societies, is one of the worst maladies of human history, and will probably do us all in before too long. To build a new society, we must denounce our militarized culture of hate and violence. We must name the crimes of empire and fight for justice. We must stand unequivocally with the oppressed of the earth. To refuse to fight the scourge of empire is to be complicit in the chauvinism and boutique political theater that characterizes the American liberal class, much of the Canadian middle class, and many on the left. We will never be able to build global alliances to overthrow the system of global capitalism if we do not fight the enemy, and the enemy is in our midst. We are all becoming victims of the American empire, and we must all destroy it. Thank you.